Hello, FINA 331 students. This is an example of working through a problem like problem 12 on your first homework. So we've got all the information posted here, and we'll just go from there. So the key thing, the goal we're trying to find here is the operating cash flow from this past year. So there are several places that cash can come from. So it can come from operations. It can come from reducing capital spending. It can come from reducing net working capital. It could come from getting cash from the stockholders or paying a smaller dividend, and it could come from raising more debt or paying less interest. And so we're going to exploit all of these things to, the relationships between them to find the answer to this question. So we know a couple things. First, we know that the cash flow from assets is equal to the operating cash flow minus the capital spending minus net working capital spending. So if we increase working capital, we're going to spend. And if we increase capital spending, we will spend. And if we increase operating cash flow, we get. And the net of all of those are going to be the cash flow from assets. Now, cash that comes off from assets has to go somewhere. So it either has to go to pay down debt, it has to get paid as interest, it has to pay a dividend to the stockholders, it has to buy back shares, or it has to decrease or it has to go into the firm as paid in capital. Okay, so cash flow from that. So this is where the money is coming into, and then it's going to go out to somewhere. And so we want to find out. For this problem, we're going to exploit the fact that it has to go somewhere to find that answer. So we are going to track where the cash went to shareholders. We're going to see how much went to the shareholders, and then we're going to check how much went to debt holders. Right. So cash sent to the shareholders can get sent in a couple different ways. So one way is it pays a dividend. So if we sent $1 as a dividend, that would be $1 of cash flow to the shareholders, so that comes in as a positive. Okay. Now another place that we can send cash to shareholders is by repurchasing stock or buying, reducing the number of shares that are outstanding, calling equity back in. Or alternatively, if we issue new shares, we sell more shares to the public, that will generate cash for the firm and be a negative cash flow to shareholders. So it will be a cash drain from shareholders. So one thing we want to track is the new common stock minus the old common stock. Right, so this is just the change in the amount of stock that's out there. It could go up if we issue new shares. It could go down if we repurchase shares. Now I typed a minus sign back here, and the reason I did is that if you think about it, if we increase the amount of stock, that means that we sold some shares and got some money. So if stock increases from here to here, we sold and received cash, and that means that cash flow to shareholders is negative for that transaction because they paid the firm. So that's why this comes in as a minus right here. We have a minus there because it's coming in that way. So we can either repurchase or issue new shares, and we can also retain money in the firm or return money formerly paid in to the shareholders. So we have another new minus old, but now it's paid in capital. So if the firm makes money and it just keeps it in the bank, what's naturally going to occur is paid in capital will increase. Right, so this the combination of all these things is going to produce the cash flow to shareholders. Okay. So for this problem, we have 17 cents in dividends, or I guess that would be 0.17 million, so 170,000 in dividends. And then we'll do minus, minus new book equity. So new book equity is 8 million. We subtract off 6.3, the old book equity. And then we need to do the same thing for paid-in capital. So we have need to pay 1 million in paid-in capital, and then later we're going to have 2.5 million paid-in capital. Now that's going to net out to 7.13 for this problem. So it's just an application of the cash flow to shareholders formula. Cash flow to debt holders looks very similar. So you have, instead of dividends, you have interest. And there's no version of paid-in capital for debt, so we only have new minus old debt. So in this case, our interest, we have two interests listed. They paid 8 million in 2010 and 0.28 in 2011. But interest is a flow measure, not a stock measure. When we pay interest every year, as opposed to an asset where it sits. It's just a reference to historical cost. Interest is a flow, and that means the only interest that's relevant to our calculation is interest paid in the current year. So we want the 0.28 million, which represents interest paid this year. New debt, the new book value of debt is 8.3 million, and the old was 6.3. All right, let's just check and make sure. We've got long-term debt of 7.4 is the old one. 7.4 is the old one. 6.3 is book value of common stock. So we've got 8.3 million. And back minus that, you get this. Okay, so now we've got, we raised 7.13 million from stockholders, and we raised 620,000 from bondholders. And now we can tackle this piece down here. So we know that the cash flow from assets is, so all the cash that comes from assets, either by not capital spending or by recovering working capital or by getting operating cash flow, has to go somewhere, and we know that that total now is equal to this, right? The sum of these things. So we know we are generating 7.75 million, or negative 7.75 million in cash from assets. So now we need to take that number and solve for operating cash flow. So notice down here, we know cash flow from assets, so now we need to add capital spending to both sides to get them to cancel, and we need to add net working capital spending to get it to cancel on both sides. And so we're going to take this, and now capital spending is, capital spending is 5.7 million. So we spent 5.7 million in capital spending, and then net working capital was reduced by 9 million. So we actually didn't spend on working capital. We negative spent on working capital. So that is going to come in as a positive. Oops. So let's see. This should not be E9. This should be E8. But, notice now, see, this is, we've got the negative 7.75. That's on the other side of the equation, right? So we need to be adding capital spending and subtracting net working capital, but now this should be there, so this needs to come in as a negative. but all on the other side. So these all need to switch, and then you get the right answer. So we've got, and you can think about it this way. So we have, in terms of cash flow from assets, we needed to raise $7.75 million. Okay? So that's how much we needed to raise. Now, that was made worse because we spent $5.7 million in capital spending. So that made that would cause that to be worse. But the net working capital, we recovered $9 million, so that made it $9 million better. So for it to work out to be 7.75, we must have had a really bad operating year. Our operating year must be worse than 7.75, because if you compare capital spending to net working capital spending, we actually spent negative money. We got money back from working capital, and we spent some of it on capital spending, but the rest we had available. And after you take the operating cash flow and what we had left, it added up to negative 7.75, which means we must have lost a lot of money operating-wise. And that's why you end up at a negative 11.05 number. So that is the method for tackling problem 12. So you need to know a couple identities: the cash flow to shareholders, the cash flow to debt holders. That cash flow to assets is equal to these three things in cell E11. And then lastly, that these two, the cash flow from assets, are also equal to cash flow to shareholders and cash flow to debt holders. So that, in a nutshell, is how to tackle problem 12. Now yours will look slightly different, but hopefully that's enough information to get you started.